healthy lease is one where both the landlord and tenant follow all the terms stated in the lease agreement. Unfortunately, there are times when the tenant may not comply with one or several clauses in the agreement, leading to an eviction process initiated by the landlord. An eviction notice is a legal document sent to the tenant after lease violation, giving them the choice to either fix the problem or leave the rental property. While the specifics of eviction notices can vary depending on the state, they serve the same basic purpose. In this video, we'll walk you through everything you need to know about lease violations and the standard eviction process. We'll cover the different types of lease violations, how to handle them, and the steps involved in the eviction process. Additionally, if you're looking for free eviction notice forms to make the process easier, be sure to check out DoorLoop's rental forms for any resources you may need, which will be linked down below. So let's get started. What is an eviction notice? First, let's address what's an eviction. An eviction is considered a legal process which involves removing a person from a rental property. Now, why would you want to evict a tenant? There are many reasons. Most of the time, tenants get evicted because they don't want to pay rent. However, even if the tenant did pay rent, any other lease violation can cause the landlord to start an eviction process. As mentioned before, there are different rules for evictions in each state, so landlords must ensure they're following the law if they want to avoid legal problems in the future. There are two types of evictions you can consider. Curable notice. A curable notice will give the tenant some days to comply with the rule they broke or cure the lease violations they did. If the tenant doesn't pay rent, for example, the landlord can send a notice to pay rent or quit. Tenants who fail to pay rent after this period may get evicted right away. Incurable notice. Here, there's no option for the tenant to cure their lease violations. If they receive an incurable notice, they must leave within the specified period, which can vary depending on the type of lease. In either case, landlords need a court order before they can evict their tenant legally. If the tenant fails to move out after the notice period, the landlord can send a sheriff to remove them and any belongings they had. What is considered a lease violation? A lease violation is any circumstance in which the person renting doesn't comply with the original conditions of the lease agreement. Now, how many lease violations can landlords tolerate before evicting their tenants? That sort of depends on the person. Some landlords may start their eviction cases as soon as they see the first violation. However, it's always recommended to wait until the landlord sends 2 or more lease violation notices so that the tenant fixes the problem. If they don't, then the landlord can start the legal proceedings. Keep in mind that the circumstances may be different for each case. It's always recommended that landlords consider how much time the lease has left and the severity of the problem. What are the different types of eviction notices? Let's expand on the different types of notice. As mentioned before, there are many reasons why a landlord would want to break the rental agreement, and not all reasons are due to the tenant's fault. Let's take a look at the common scenarios where a landlord may want to end the rental agreement. Notice to pay rent or quit. Unpaid rent is one of the most common reasons why landlords choose to evict their tenants. Under most lease agreements, both the landlord and tenant specify an amount and date to pay rent, so not doing so is considered a violation. Overall, a notice to pay rent or quit will give the tenant a chance to pay rent during the specified notice periods. If they fail to do so, then they must leave the property. It's vital to note that some landlords are allowed to charge late fees for unpaid rent, so the tenant may have to pay for those too. Notice of violation of the lease. Here, the landlord could send a notice to the tenant if they broke any of the terms of the lease agreement. If the tenant has a pet on the property, for example, and the landlord specified they couldn't have pets on the property, then they could receive a notice. As with the notice to pay rent or quit, this type of notice is considered one to cure or quit. The tenant has the chance to fix the problem if they want to avoid getting evicted. Notice of termination of lease. Not all lease agreements have to end because of a violation. If the lease agreement is one that automatically renews, the landlord can send a notice if they don't want to renew it again. The notice periods in this case will depend on the type of lease both parties were working with and the local housing laws. Notice to quit. Landlords send a notice to quit when they want to remove a tenant for any other reason that wasn't their fault. The landlord may want to do this when they want to move into the property, renovate the property, sell the property, or any other valid reason. Make sure you follow your state's laws before sending a notice to quit, as not all reasons may be valid where you live. Moreover, whenever you download eviction notice templates, you must ensure that they follow your local laws. Difference between tenants at will and tenants at sufferance. You already know that if the tenant fails to comply with your notice after you send it, you can institute legal proceedings to get them out. However, keep in mind that some states give protection to certain tenants, particularly tenants at will. A tenant at will is a person that stays on your property with your permission. If you give them permission to stay, then the state will give them a longer notice period. On the other hand, holdover tenants or tenants at sufferance don't have that many protection measures from the state. As opposed to a tenant at will, a holdover tenant is someone who stays in your property without your permission, so they will get less time to move out. In some cases, the landlord may not even have to send a notice to quit before starting legal proceedings with their local court. Can you evict a tenant if they don't pay rent? In most cases, you should be able to send an eviction notice to your tenant for non-payment of rent. On the other hand, all state and governments can impose their own laws for evictions. The best thing you can do before sending an eviction notice is to contact an attorney and ask. Now, it's critical that you keep in mind that there are certain scenarios where a tenant may legally be allowed to withhold rent if you send an eviction notice. In some states, tenants can legally deduct or withhold rent if their landlord doesn't meet their obligations to keep the property habitable. If you feel you're complying with all your obligations and the tenant doesn't follow your eviction notice, you may want to talk with a lawyer to sort things out. Is evicting a tenant free? Technically, you can send a free eviction notice to your tenant, whether it's a notice to pay rent or a notice to quit. However, keep in mind that there are many other fees you may have to pay during the eviction process, including court and attorney fees. Depending on the case, the total cost for evicting your tenant could range from hundreds to even thousands of dollars, which is why it's important to try and solve the issue first before sending an eviction notice. Do you need an eviction notice? Having a tenant who doesn't follow the terms of the lease can be one of the most frustrating things to experience. However, it's highly recommended to be patient and not remove the tenant without following the standard procedures for evictions. First, make sure you document all your communications with your tenant if possible. Additionally, make sure you seek legal counsel to ensure you're doing everything by the book. Another thing to consider is excessive calls and messages. No matter how frustrated you are, avoid calling and texting the tenant excessively or making threats. The tenant could document all of that and then use it in court to prove harassment. Considering all of what we previously mentioned, we highly recommend serving an eviction notice the right way. How much notice should you give your tenant? It depends on several factors, such as your state's regulations, the violation, and the lease type. Some states don't require landlords any notice period before evicting their tenant, although it's still recommended to follow the legal eviction process. Notice periods can range from 3 to 60 days. Week-to-week leases, for example, may warrant a 7-day eviction notice. On the other hand, a month-to-month tenancy may ask for 30 to 60 days notice. If you're sending a notice to pay rent or quit, you must first evaluate the maximum period for overdue rent. You must wait until that period ends before sending the eviction notice. Do you need to hire an attorney to evict a tenant? Not necessarily. You could download a sample eviction notice document, fill it out with all required information, and then send it. However, if you don't know your state's laws, you may have issues later, as not all templates or samples have state-specific clauses. If this is the first time you're sending an eviction notice, we do recommend you seek legal counseling with a lawyer, as they will help you navigate the process much easier. What can you do if you have multiple tenants in your lease? In most cases, you can either send an eviction notice to all your tenants or don't send it to anyone. Typically, the court will not grant you full possession of your unit unless you name all the tenants living there in your eviction notice process. With that being said, theoretically, you can evict a single tenant if you have several in your unit. However, there is an exception. If a particular tenant is causing any problems to the property, the neighbors, or the other tenants living there, you may have permission to send an eviction notice to them and pursue other legal measures. How long will it take to evict a tenant? That depends on the case and the state. Typically, the process will take anywhere from 1 to 3 months. We hope you found this video informative and helpful in understanding the basics of lease violations and the eviction process. Remember, eviction is a very serious matter, and it's important to follow the proper procedures and laws to avoid any legal issues. If you're in need of eviction notice forms, DoorLoop has got you covered. Check out our free forms library, which includes a variety of rental documents to help make the process a little bit easier. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more videos just like this one. For more information on eviction notices, be sure to check out our blog linked in the description below, and we'll see you in the next one.